Steve, you got a good story for me.
So, we're here in Port Townsend. I moved here about 12 years ago. They legalized pot in Portland, and I couldn't make my money sticking my neck out anymore. So I moved up here, and I still had my dog Hobo, and I had some money because a friend had made me buy my grow house there in Portland, and years later it was worth money. So I bought this place with like an apartment up top, which is really a glorified ADU, and a garage downstairs that I made into a studio. So it was about 10 years ago, and I'd gone to Squim, a nearby town, for some laser eye surgery. And I come back and I pull up the street, and I'd left my dog Hobo, who was a German Shepherd Pit Bull mix, and his nickname was Jaws because you couldn't put him in a regular crate because he'd chew through 10 gauge steel, nothing flat, and pull it out. And so I had to buy a lion's cage with 20 gauge steel. And if you want a conversation piece, have a lion's cage in your home. So I left Hobo in his lion's cage, and I come back, and he's out playing in the street. And I thought, what the fuck? He was an escape artist. He was famous for escaping, but I knew he couldn't get out of that cage. So I grabbed him, I went inside, and I step inside, and the lion cage is right in front of me against the wall, and the door is open. And then in front of me, there's a stool, in front of my favorite chair, and it had all the laundry that I'd left in the dryer piled up. And then I hear something, and I look to the end of the room, and there's some guy at my desktop. He's about 30, looks like he's a skinny guy, and he's sitting at my desktop, and he's reading my chapter from my first memoir, High and Dry. And at first I thought I'd stepped into some alternate dimension. Here I was, everything was the same except I was shorter and skinnier, but I had hair. I like that part, I had hair. Then I thought, I haven't smoked that, just some chem dog while I was driving to the eye appointment. So I said, hey buddy, who the fuck are you? And, I had some ear and chair, and he spins around and he goes, I don't know, who the fuck are you? And I said, what are you doing in my house? And he said, sorry, man, don't start that. This is my place. And I said, no. All right. I said, this is my house. I said, not only that, you're wearing my clothes. And he's wearing one of my hemp t-shirts and my underwear, except it was like a 2X shirt. And, this little guy, he was just swimming in it. And he said, well, I thought I just lost a bunch of weight. And I thought, yeah, this is getting ridiculous. I said, what's your name? And he said, he actually thought for a minute. He said, I don't know. And I said, well, where do you live? And he thought again. He said, I don't know. And so I assumed, he's kind of a goofy guy with all the shit they give crazy people now. I thought he was on some opioid or another. So I said, are you on drugs? And he goes, no. He said, I do feel like I'm in a trance all the time. And I said, well, you want me to call the cops? I said, I'm 75. I've never done it in my life. I've never called a cop. And I was hoping to die before I did, but I'll call a cop. And he goes, no cops involved. And I said, well, you gotta put your clothes on and get the fuck out of here. And he just looks at me, and I said, you did come here with clothes on, right? And he goes, I don't think so. And so I thought, and there weren't any clothes around. So I thought, maybe I lived in the woods. Maybe this guy has been out there for weeks, and when I leave, he comes in to jack off, watching porn on my desktop. If he came there naked. So I go where all my clothes are, and at the bottom of my pile of laundry is these khaki pants and an old t-shirt and a hat and some socks and some old rotted tennis shoes. And so I took him over to him and I said, here's your clothes. And he goes, believe me, I wouldn't wear anything like that. And I said, you don't know your own name, but you remember your style sense? He goes, yeah, I guess so. And so I hand him to him, and he stands up, and the underwear, which is like 3 sizes too big for him, falls down, and he's got like this giant cock, like a fire hose, and this little tinker toy of a guy. And I thought, that's probably his problem. He probably just been playing with that all day. And then I thought, shit, maybe he was jerking off on my computer. So I looked around the desk. There was no cum stains or anything. And I thought the guy had the grace to just do it into the old carpet here. So I handed him his clothes. I said, get dressed. And he goes, well, I'm very modest, He's standing there like that. He said, you and Hobo have to go outside. No, and he didn't call him Hobo. What did he call him? Oh, Chester or something like
But
that.
he like named him
Yeah, he
different?
named him some childhood dog that he knew. Chipper, that was it. He kept saying, oh, Chipper, I love Chipper. And so Chipper and I go outside. We wait a couple of minutes. This guy comes out, and he's still got my glasses on, reading glasses. So I took them off. Him. I said, those are kind of expensive reading glasses. I got to take those back. And he goes, seriously, he goes, I can see. I can see. And I said, yeah. And so we go out, but he did hand me his hat. I had that around for years. He said, believe me, I wouldn't wear a hat like that. So I said, fine. I tossed it, and we go out in the street, and I said, you got any money? And he said, no. So I looked in my pockets. The only thing I had was $5. I gave him $5, and he goes, I'm pretty sure a guy like me, I don't need money. I said, buddy, you need it. I said, and he's just standing there looking around, and he said, what town is this? And I said, Port Townsend. And he said, well, is that California, Oregon, Washington, Canada? And I said, it's in Washington, on the top of the Olympic Peninsula. And he says, what would I be doing here? I don't know. I said, where are you going to go now? And he said, well, where would you go if you didn't know where you were? I said, good question, buddy. Again, I will call the cops. And he said, no, just tell me how to get out of here. So, I told him, you go up to Jackman, you take a left, eventually you'll get into town. And he walks off, and he got about 50 yards away, and he stopped, and he turned around, and he goes, so long, Chipper, I'll never forget you. And then he turns around and walks off, and I looked at Hobo, and I said, yeah, fat chance. And then we went back into the studio, and I sat down at the computer, and I thought, fuck, I forgot to ask him if he liked the book.